the howl of the Chisos. I had camped in the Chisos Mountains before, but never this far from the main trails or this deep into the backcountry. The high desert air felt cooler at this elevation, carrying a sharp scent of stone and dry brush. I set my small tent beside a cluster of boulders overlooking a narrow canyon below. The silence here was complete. No humans, no distant vehicles, just the wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. As darkness settled across the mountains, the temperature dropped quickly, and the air became crisp and biting. I set up a small stove beside the tent and watched the stars slowly appear one by one above the ridgeline. Nights in the Chisos always felt immense, almost overwhelming, and the desert wind whispered softly through scattered shrubs and rocks. Everything felt untouched and eternal, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I had just finished eating when the first sound drifted across the canyon. At first I assumed it was a distant coyote somewhere far below the ridge, but the tone felt wrong. The howl stretched far longer than any coyote call I had ever heard. It rose slowly, climbing higher through the canyon air before dropping into a deep, vibrating rumble that echoed through the rocks and into my chest. The echo faded after a few tense moments, leaving the canyon silent beneath the darkening sky. I waited, straining to hear any further noises. Coyotes were common in Big Bend, but this howl had been different, deeper, heavier, more resonant. I told myself it was probably just the echo bouncing off the cliffs. Still, the sound left a cold knot in my stomach, and the wilderness around me suddenly felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. I crawled into my tent to grab my sleeping bag, but the night was not quiet for long. The howl returned, closer this time, rising and dropping in pitch with a disturbing rhythm. My heart raced as I peered out from the tent flap. The canyon remained dark and empty. No movement disturbed the rocky floor, yet I could feel the vibration of the sound rolling through the ridge beneath my feet. Something was out there. The howl faded once more, leaving silence in its wake. I gripped my flashlight and slowly stepped outside, scanning the rocky ridge around my camp. Shadows stretched long across the desert floor. No animal, no shape of any kind moved in the beam. Only the pale moonlight on the stones and brush. Yet the sense of being watched lingered, heavy and oppressive. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as if something waited. The silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the soft wind rustling dry desert grass. Then the howl exploded again across the canyon, louder and sharper than before. I flinched at the sheer power of it. The sound seemed to vibrate through the rocks, surrounding my camp from all sides. The ridge itself seemed to shudder under the echo. I instinctively took a step back, gripping my flashlight like a weapon against an unseen threat. I circled the edge of my small campsite, the beam of the flashlight sweeping over jagged rocks and sparse desert brush. If any animal had been near, there should have been footprints, disturbed sand, something, yet the ground was completely undisturbed and the shadows remained unbroken. My pulse raced as I searched every inch, but the canyon below looked calm, empty, lifeless, completely at odds with the violent, echoing howls that had shaken the mountains a moment ago. Then the howl came again, this time seeming to originate from the opposite ridge. I spun toward it, straining to locate the source. The distance made no sense. No coyote, no mountain lion, could have moved that far so quickly. The sound ricocheted violently, bouncing off every ridge and cliff, multiplying itself until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The mountains themselves seemed alive, resonating with the terrifying call. I crouched low near the ridge, listening carefully. My breath formed faint clouds in the cold desert air. Somewhere out there, in the darkness of the canyon, something large was moving, but without leaving a trace. No rocks shifted, no brush rustled, nothing, only the sound. The canyon seemed to hold its breath as if the landscape itself was an accomplice, echoing and amplifying the presence of whatever was out there in the night. I forced myself to walk a slow circle around the campsite, scanning every rock, crevice, and patch of sand. If a creature had approached, there would be tracks in the dust, disturbed stones, a sign, but the ground remained perfect, untouched. The more I searched, the more impossible it felt. The howls had clearly circled my camp multiple times, yet the desert floor betrayed no evidence of movement. Something was moving that should not have existed. Just as I turned back to the tent, another howl ripped across the canyon, closer than ever. My heart leaped in my chest, and I spun, aiming my flashlight in every direction. The beam barely touched the canyon floor far below the ridge. The canyon looked empty, yet the echo suggested a presence so close it could strike. The wind carried the sound with a terrifying immediacy, as if it was moving with me across the rocks. I scanned the cliffs with the beam, moving slowly, carefully. Over each ledge and crevice, nothing. No glowing eyes, no rustle of fur or brush. Nothing, only rock, shadow, and the infinite desert night. And yet the sound had originated close by, somewhere along the ridge above my camp. The absence of tracks, the impossibility of distance, and the unearthly depth of the howl began to form a knot of dread in my chest. Then it happened again, this time behind me. I spun, flashlight in hand, sweeping across my campsite. The wind rustled my tent softly, but no one stood there. No shadow, no figure, nothing. The ridge remained empty, illuminated in pale moonlight. I froze, realizing that the howls had moved around the camp, closer and closer, and yet nothing visible had approached. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with anticipation. My heartbeat pounded as I surveyed the desert floor once more. Dust remained undisturbed. Sand and rocks held no evidence of movement, yet the howls had circled the ridge repeatedly, growing nearer each time. Something was moving in these mountains, something far larger than any predator I had encountered. Something that could traverse the cliffs and canyon walls without leaving tracks. I swallowed hard, knowing that the night had only just begun. I stood frozen for several long moments, my flashlight sweeping the campsite and surrounding rocks over and over. The wind carried the dry desert scent through the boulders, brushing against my face. Nothing moved. No shadow passed, no brush shifted. Yet the echo of that howl still hummed faintly in the ridge beneath me, a vibration that seemed to pulse along the stone itself. The mountains were alive with sound, and I was not alone. The canyon below remained silent, heavy with darkness, but my nerves were taut. Another howl suddenly tore through the night, closer and louder than before, bouncing off the cliffs and sending vibrations through my chest. The sound rose from somewhere along the slope beneath my ridge, twisting and changing as if it had a mind of its own. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching lightly against the gravel and desert sand scattered across the ledge. I raised the flashlight and scanned the canyon floor below, the beam cutting a narrow path through the black. It passed over jagged boulders, sandy patches, and spindly desert brush, revealing nothing moving. No animal, no silhouette, not a flicker of life anywhere. The stillness was unnerving, but the howl suggested a presence nearby. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath, concealing a predator that walked without leaving a trace. Another scream echoed suddenly from somewhere below, violent and bone-chilling. My chest tightened and my instincts screamed to retreat. The canyon amplified the sound in all directions, and it seemed to surround me from every angle. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as I focused on the canyon floor, searching for a sign of movement. But the dust and sand were untouched, the rocks unmoved. Whatever had made that noise was impossibly light, impossibly careful. I scanned the ground near the ridge edge again, carefully checking every patch of sand and stone. Any creature moving across this slope should have left footprints or disturbed dust, but everything was perfectly still. The realization pressed in on me. Something large and intelligent was moving along the canyon walls without touching the ground at all, and the echoes of its presence carried through the desert as if the mountains themselves were warning me. A low, uneasy sensation crept through me as I realized how impossible this was. The canyon walls were mostly bare rock, impossible to traverse without effort. Yet the howls continued, moving around my campsite, shifting in location with no observable source. I forced myself to breathe slowly and keep the flashlight steady. The desert was alive with something unearthly tonight, something that had learned to hunt without leaving a trace on the rocks or sand. Then I saw it. A dark shape shifting across a narrow ledge higher on the cliff. It moved slowly, but with terrifying confidence, its silhouette long and low against the stone. I froze, heart racing, as I realized the howls had been coming from that very figure. The creature's steps were precise, deliberate, almost ceremonial as it hugged the cliffside, moving like it had been hunting here for years. The next howl erupted from above, closer to the ridge this time, resonating through the stone beneath my feet. I lifted the flashlight, scanning every ledge, every crevice, every shadow. The shape paused and then moved again, gliding across the jagged rock, as if it were weightless. Each step produced no sound, no dust disturbed, nothing that could betray its presence. It was methodical, patient, and impossibly fast. I focused on its outline. Its body was long, low, and muscular. The moonlight caught the faint edges of its head as it paused on a narrow ledge, looking directly toward my campsite. Then the howl came again, vibrating through the mountains with bone-rattling power. The echo made the cliffs tremble, amplifying the sound in a way that seemed almost supernatural. It was aware of me now, and I could feel it studying my every move. I realized then that the creature was not moving randomly. Every step it took aligned with the position of my tent. My heart hammered as I calculated the impossible distance it had crossed in near silence. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I watched it shift higher, approaching along the jagged ledge with unnerving precision. Each movement was deliberate, predatory, as if it knew exactly how to stalk without ever being seen. Suddenly, it paused again, lifting its head skyward, muzzle stretching toward the black Chisos sky. Its low growl transformed into a piercing howl, reverberating off the canyon walls, echoing through the ridges and ridges beyond. I could feel it deep in my chest, a terrifying resonance that seemed to shake my very bones. The echo of the sound was both a warning and an announcement. Something intelligent, something aware, was present tonight. After the howl faded, the creature lowered its head and remained perfectly still on the ledge. I could see the faint outline of its long, sleek body, muscles flexing under shadowed stone. Then slowly it turned, moving along the cliff toward the ridge I occupied. Each step was controlled, careful, calculated, as if it were measuring my reaction, gauging my fear. I could feel its eyes upon me, even in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stay and watch this thing move closer. I grabbed my pack, thrust the flashlight into a side pocket, and started down the narrow trail away from the ridge. The howls continued, following me as I stumbled over rocks and sand. I dared not glance back at the shadowed cliff. The sound pursued me relentlessly, echoing across the desert as if the mountains themselves were alive. I ran blindly, boots striking rocks and desert gravel, heart hammering in my chest. Each time I turned my head, I felt the weight of those howls pressing into my shoulders. The wind carried them, bending the echoes, following me down the trail in a way that made the impossible seem inevitable. Every step I took only seemed to draw the creature nearer in sound, though I never glimpsed it again in the darkness. Finally, I reached the lower desert floor and collapsed near a cluster of hardy shrubs. The howls faded behind me, placed by the faint rustle of desert wind. When I finally dared to look back toward the ridge, the cliffs were empty. No shadow, no movement, nothing. And yet I knew the truth. Something had been hunting me from the mountains. Something that could strike without leaving a single mark.